One needed to make his way to 13 Miller's Court in the Whitechapel district of London after a report of a woman lying dead inside her boarding room. Through a broken window pane could be seen what looked like a medical cadaver left exposed on a mattress. Only upon entering the room was the extent of the hideous damage to Jack the Ripper's last victim, the only one to be found indoors, visible up close. One was obligated to step alone into a mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, California, in March of 1997, after an anonymous tip of a mass suicide on the premises. There, almost immediately inside, were 10 bodies in identical black shirts and sweatpants, white Nike sneakers, and armbands showing the phrase, "Heaven's Gate Away Team." 29 corpses just like them, slowly decomposing in the heat, were waiting to be discovered in other rooms. And one was duty-bound to be the first to part the entrance of the Protective Custody Unit of New Mexico State Penitentiary, 36 hours after prisoners rioted in February of 1980 and ran wild throughout the property. Some cell bars in the PCU were twisted and broken after blowtorches had been used by vengeful inmates to burn through them. When the lights went on, it was revealed that 12 cons they'd targeted as snitches lay tortured and murdered inside those cells. Maybe the dreams of those who discovered these scenes became dominated by images of a single closed door, concealing either death or great danger. And maybe in those dreams, they were again confronted with the choice that defined their professional lives, whether to move through that door as their training demanded, or at long last weaken and run toward the arms of pitying angels.
My name is Gene Ramon. This is the story of my last day as a patrolman for St. Joseph County. Friday, December 8th, 2004. 7:05 a.m., roll call. Nothing memorable. A review of some wanted person flyers and a bolo on a stolen vehicle that belonged to the governor's kid. 7:25 a.m., a quick inspection of my assigned vehicle showed a check engine light, nothing serious, some emissions thing. I could deal with it later. Never did. 8 a.m., I was at St. Thomas the Apostle Church on the west side of South Bend for maybe the strangest security assignment I'd ever been given. Feel free not to talk about this one with anyone, Sergeant Vasquez had said to me the day before. This was the first of the 3 incidents that day I'll never forget. My job was to check the visitors as they came in through the church and just stand by at the funeral ceremony at 8:30. There was a list, and if you weren't on it, you weren't getting past me. That simple. Officer John Remy was at the edge of the parking lot doing the same thing. We checked a total of 2 people in. The deceased's sister and his attorney. The only other people there that day were the parish parson and the priest who would conduct the ceremony. The urn where the ashes were stored was set up on a little linen-covered table up front near the altar. No flowers or decor anywhere. No printed program. Everything was silent. The parson had set out a carafe of coffee, a stack of styrofoam cups, and a new box of Hostess donuts, the multi-pack. Nobody touched any of it. The 2 mourners gave only a passing glance to the urn, and everyone shuffled outside into the cold. To get to the north end of the cemetery, we all had to walk over a little footbridge through some tall trees. No one exchanged a word. I kept an eye on the open borders of the cemetery for possible members of the press. But whoever had set this all up had done a very good job of keeping it secret. The only people I saw were a couple of old folks standing at a faraway grave, one sipping Starbucks. It started to snow lightly, just as promised by WNDU. We were due for about 4 inches by sundown. In case you were ever wondering what a priest might read at the private burial ceremony for the most heinous serial killer in the history of Indiana, who had hung himself in prison, this man picked a Bible passage I looked up much later. It's from Romans 8:35. Who will separate us from the love of Christ? Shall hardship or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? As it is written, for your sake we are being killed all day long. It was all lost on me. I'm not much of a believer. Aside from acknowledging the showing of kinship and friendship of the deceased's sister and lawyer, and wishing them Godspeed and comfort after he closed his Bible, the priest didn't really say anything more. There was a moment of silence for prayer. No one seemed to be exactly praying. The plain urn with Mitchell Derrick Beard's ashes in it was placed inside the shallow grave by the parson. Just a sheet lining it, nothing fancier. The lawyer, who looked like he may have retired some time ago, and the sister, who looked sort of sickly and hadn't bothered to dress formally, were given a trowel to pass between them, and they tossed a bit of dirt into the grave with no visible emotion. And then they turned and left, heads down against the snowflakes, having no communication with each other as their feet thudded on the skinny wooden planks of the footbridge. That was the secret end of Mitchell Beard. I was there for it. Just his last name was printed on the tiny headstone, and the dates 1965 to 2004. 12 victims he'd killed, the youngest being 19, the oldest 71. I had a buddy who'd worked briefly on that case. The last 2 victims were found crammed inside a big plastic tote marked Legos. I radioed with John from beside the grave to let him know the mourners were headed in his direction, and I took one last look around the cemetery. Then I crossed the footbridge myself, passed through the warmly lit church again, and came back out into the gray daylight. And I saw, as Mitchell Beard's sister got alone into a hurting old Honda, that she was making away with that unsampled box of Hostess donuts under one arm. 9:25 a.m. A stop at a residence to follow up on a breaking and entering that had happened 2 nights before. A couple of conflicting stories drew that out a bit. 10:10. I was called in for backup on an unexplained alarm in a locked, high-dollar goods warehouse on West Sample Street. Nothing suspicious found. Then lunch. 1:15, assistance with rerouting traffic at Chapin and Napier after a school bus collided with a delivery truck. 2 hurt. Ice was mixing in with the snow now, unexpectedly. Driving toward the airport at 2:30 on a bit of personal business, I pulled over beside a hotel shuttle vehicle, stopped on the shoulder on North Bendix. It was a 12-seater, empty. The driver was standing beside it, no coat or jacket, just a customer service vest. He looked dazed, pacing back and forth. Initially, I thought he might be drunk, but I realized he was in shock. He had difficulty getting words out. He said he was almost certain he'd just hit someone. He admitted he'd been looking at his cell phone, trying to find out if his wife might be leaving work early because of the weather. Just 2 or 3 seconds of shifting his attention to the little screen, and he'd heard some kind of contact from the front of the shuttle, and heard what seemed like a human voice, maybe a shout. But he'd found nothing. I immediately circled the shuttle on foot. The road was clear, slowly going white. On the right side of the vehicle, a guardrail lined the shoulder up and down the road. Over it there was a short grassy embankment whose visuals were perfectly clear, except for one blind spot made by a bulky formation of abandoned cement blocks and cast-offs that someone had illegally dumped off the side of the road. I took note of that, and then crouched to look under the vehicle, preparing myself to see something bad. But there were no out-of-the-ordinary shapes on that dark patch of tarmac. The front of the shuttle, though, did in fact show traces of contact about 24 inches off the ground, 2 separate small dents on the grille, though theoretically maybe not from that day. No blood, no crack in the windshield. I looked down the ravine. I wouldn't feel I'd done a totally complete search until I got down there and looked behind that pile of cement. The slope was a hard 45-degree angle, but led down only about 10 feet. I paused to check on the driver and had him confirm he had seen nothing but heard a voice shouting. He told me it lasted just a split second. It must have been pretty loud for him to have heard it going about 40 miles an hour with such a big engine. I radioed the situation in and told the driver to give me his keys and sit back in the driver's seat to wait for me. He was still very shaky. I stepped over the guardrail and, very carefully, skidding some in the snow, made my way down to the aggregated cement. Something about the way many of the broken blocks had settled on top of one another grated against my imagination. Unintentional temple-like formations had been created, making me think of ritual sacrifices. It didn't take long to verify there was no one lying injured behind the tallest pile. Truly, there was no one around. I struggled a little getting back up the slope and in fact fell to my knees once, banging my left one hard. When I climbed back over the guardrail, both knees were plenty wet and cold. The daylight was already beginning to fade from the sky. Night would be arriving a little early. It was time to test the driver for intoxication. He was already opening the accordion door of the shuttle and stepping out. Now he looked not just shocked and worried, but genuinely horrified. "What about," he started to say, and could barely finish as he stepped down onto the shoulder again. "Up above, up in the machinery." And he made a little thumb hook gesture to illustrate better that he was asking me to get down on my knees once again to look deeper into the undercarriage of the shuttle. I didn't know much about the underworkings of a vehicle that size, but what he was thinking seemed highly, highly unlikely. My flashlight was clipped to my belt as always. I touched my knees to the freezing pavement and shimmied as close to the tailpipe as I could, then pushed my head under the bumper a few inches, as far as I realistically could without lying prone. I shone the flashlight deep, working at a difficult angle to cover the maze of dirty mechanisms under there. And for one moment, I was completely convinced I was going to see something unimaginable. But there was, in fact, nothing there. I got up again. Officer Dan Post had now pulled over to assist, and we put the driver through the routine. There was nothing wrong with him. He'd just had a bad fright, maybe let his imagination convince him somehow of the worst. What he'd struck, if he'd struck anything, had maybe been booted on by a second vehicle. I myself once side-swiped a pinball machine on the highway while on patrol. Maybe he'd hit an unusually tall chunk of cement, though there was no dust or debris. But when we'd let the driver move on after assuring us he was okay to drive straight to the hotel beside the airport, I found myself looking all around at the empty scene, feeling very strange. And I had the fleeting thought that maybe I hadn't worked that flashlight quite deep enough under that shuttle, that I hadn't quite hit the spot up near the front wheels. It was a stupid thought, of course I had. Sometimes a mystery was just a mystery. I wanted very badly for the shift to be over because a small irrational tingle of dread had crept into me. There came the persistent feeling that I'd made a real mistake the month before when arguing myself out of quitting till the first of the year. It wasn't the actual dangers of the job or the things I'd seen that were driving me out after 4 years. It was that occasional hint of dread on a call, the sense that I might be walking into something that could break me, physically or mentally. The dread had been creeping in more often. Some cops have a faulty resistance to that feeling, and they never strengthen the way they need to. It just isn't in them to get entirely over it. And in the twilight hours after that pair of odd incidents on December 8th, it began, for the first time, to overwhelm me. Between 3 and 4:45, I had one other vehicle assistance stop, and then checked out a minor trespassing infraction, more of a misunderstanding. I told myself, you're just about done. You're going to go home, pour yourself a stiff drink, and decide once and for all whether tomorrow is the day you put in your papers and make your wife a very happy woman. I took my last radio call of the day just after dark, and when I heard what it would involve, I felt almost all of the tension in my body drain away. A curious but solvable domestic situation over in Sunnymead, an upper-middle-class neighborhood. And after that, if I never wanted to feel that old dread again, ever, I simply wouldn't have to. It was my choice entirely. Yeah, I remember thinking, why delay this? Tomorrow, it all ends. I drove to a house on Kalorama Street. The snow was tapering off, but no one was exactly in a rush to have a Friday night out on the town. I walked up the driveway, home to a couple of very nice SUVs, and toward the front door. Dispatch had gotten a bizarre call from the homeowner, a man who had locked himself inside his second-floor bathroom in fear of his own pet. It was a cat, he said, had suddenly become violent. At the time of the panicked cell phone call, the man was self-treating for some scratches and was actually afraid to emerge, even to come to the door. Animal control would have been the better people to call, but the operator told me over the radio that the guy seemed to be a little unhinged, and I might want to check out the situation first. The front door was unlocked, and I went in. Inside, lovely warmth, a very nicely furnished house with all the amenities. A big artificial Christmas tree in one corner, all lit up. Sort of looked like a professional decoration job, a bit bland. I called out loudly to the homeowner, a Mr. Redner. Back came a muffled voice from above, telling me to come up the stairs, and for God's sake, be careful. The stairs were plushly carpeted, and I didn't make a sound going up. His voice guided me down the hallway to the bathroom. The door there had been pretty thoroughly attacked, all right. Chaotic scratches were all over the bottom half, deeper scratches than I thought were possible for claws that small. And there were definitely short, thin streaks of red blending in, dark red, drying blood. I turned the knob, and upon hearing me try the lock, Redner's voice sharpened. He stated very clearly that he wasn't coming out or even opening that door until he knew for certain the cat was dead. He'd lost some blood, he said, but he didn't care. He refused my request to just look in for a moment to confirm his physical condition. I asked him for this cat's most recent whereabouts. The attack on Redner had apparently happened about 30 minutes before. He had managed to get inside the bathroom, where he'd been pinned, essentially, and made the distress call with the cat's screeching and howling going on in the background. Dispatch had mentioned those sounds to me, and had seemed a little weirded out by them. Another reason for me to show up here first. The cat had retreated only a few minutes before, maybe even at the sense that someone was walking up the drive, though that seemed far-fetched to me. "What's wrong with it?" I asked Redner, looking up and down the hallway. There was an open bedroom at one end that I'd check out first. My daughter, he called out. It's hers. She did something to it. It changed. You have no idea. Where's your daughter now? I asked. We had a fight last night, he said. She cleared out this morning. I don't know where she went. Got picked up by somebody. At the moment, I didn't need to know the specifics of this alleged transformation, so I told Redner I was going to search the house and I'd be back in 5 minutes, and that he should yell out if his physical condition seemed to be sinking, or if the cat reappeared. He agreed and told me again to be careful. Rabies is what I was thinking right off, and I assure you, from some stories I'd heard, I would not hesitate to put the animal down if it was a threat. I went into the bedroom, which was a bit messy. Only one side of the bed had been slept in. I listened for any out-of-the-ordinary sound, and then I pursed my lips and blew out in a feeble cat-summoning sound. No result. I poked my head into the open closet. No stirring of life. I left, and since the other 2 doors in the hallway were already closed, I went down the stairs. In the living room, I saw something just a little unnerving, which was some photographs arranged in a framed montage over the fireplace, which had a nice little fire going. The only people depicted in the photos were who I assumed to be Redner and his daughter. The evidence told me Redner was clearly an outdoorsman and a physically strong one. This didn't exactly jibe with his apparent cowardice over a house cat. He stood beside a teenaged girl in a couple of the pictures, though there was no contact between the two of them. His daughter hadn't felt the obligation to smile. Slightly younger versions of the two of them looked dully at the camera in a photo taken at a theme park. It was a big house, so it was going to be a little more than a 5-minute search. I started to feel a little ridiculous, but clearly there was something going on here that wasn't adding up. Come on, you stupid cat, I want to go home, I said aloud when the living room's various corners and crevices offered no trace of a pet. I headed down into the basement. The stairs down were well carpeted like everything else. It was a full basement, complete with man cave, giant TV, pool table. Banners for various local teams were affixed to the walls. I poked my head into a laundry room, and then stepped around an L corner to a mystery room whose door was also ajar. It was pretty dark in there, but a candle seemed to be glowing within. It was a smaller bedroom, a girl's bedroom, judging by a few personal care things sitting on a dresser. It didn't have the usual band posters, or even that weird anime stuff my own daughter was into back then. Really unusual art hung on the walls, abstract stuff. 2 candles were burning, and had been for a long time. They looked like they'd started out tall and conical, but now so much wax had pooled around them that the plates each one sat on might overflow soon. "Kitty, kitty," I said. Hearing just a faint suggestion of sound from behind the closet door, I nudged it open and looked in. There was a display of objects arranged on a folding card table that ate up pretty much all of the space inside that small wedge. Well, just 2 objects, really. One was a very small laptop computer, playing an audio file very softly, screen glowing bright blue. The timeline spikes were visible in whatever software was doing the job, a vertical progress line barely moving across them because the file, according to a data display on the bottom, was 16 hours long. The sound was soft, jumbled voices, all laid on top of one another. So jumbled I couldn't make out individual words. I thought I heard at least 3 different languages being spoken, none of them English. The second object was a petrified human arm, cut off neatly just below the shoulder, gray in color, palm up and slightly curling. At first, of course, I thought it was a prop, but the couple of small tattoos on the arm looked entirely natural, and the skin had convincing grain and flaws. More than a dozen incisions had been made in the skin to create tiny pockets, insets. Some of them had been filled carefully with tiny, oblong blue and purple jewels, which caught the candlelight just so. I had to lean in very close to detect what had been tucked into the other pockets. They were tiny eyes, smaller than human eyes, the eyes of an animal. A bit of a mess had been made of the job. It must have been difficult to work with misshapen lumps of wet biology that small, using tweezers, maybe. At the end of the arm, the upturned palm cradled 3 severed heads of 3 different eyeless snakes. I got on the radio as I went back up the basement stairs and described the new situation to dispatch in some detail. I requested backup, which would be arriving in less than 10 minutes. When I disconnected, I heard Redner calling something out behind his bathroom door from above, and I trotted through the living room and up to the 2nd floor. He was asking if I just heard something, but I had not. I'd been too far away. He said he'd heard the cat again, maybe somewhere on the 1st floor. "Get some help in here," he yelled, voice muffled. I made him back his story up a little bit and tell me more about this transformation business. He said his daughter was into some strange things. Witchy curse stuff, he called it. It had all been bad between them since her mother died 6 years before. He'd told his daughter the night before he was going to cut off her money if she kept seeing a particular weird guy. She'd responded by telling him he could expect the cat to rip his throat out. A ridiculous threat which meant nothing to him then. She'd left that morning even before he got up for work at 5. He claimed to be unaware of anything in his daughter's bedroom closet. He'd been forbidden to go anywhere near her bedroom. I tried to pressure him to come out, assuring him I was armed and backup was on its way. "The cat's getting bigger, I swear to God," he cried, and the door stayed locked. I was turning away from it when I finally heard what he was talking about. The growling was so wet and low and throaty, it seemed to be coming from something different than a cat, something with a much, much bigger voice box. The sound shouldn't have been able to reach up to me where I stood, well beyond the top of the staircase, but it did. It sounded like a mix of threat and contentment, and I think now of a lion looking around its den after hearing a possible intruder walking past somewhere in the bushes. "Do you hear that?" Redner cried. I removed my gun from its holster and moved to the top of the stairs and looked down, waiting to see if something might appear. The reddish-green ambient glow of the Christmas tree around the corner spread faintly over the foyer's wooden floor. I told Redner I'd be right back, likely joined by another officer by that time. Now I told him it was just fine if he wanted to stay where he was. From below, there came the sound of something's heavy feet padding quickly across the floor, and following that, some object or objects were displaced with consecutive hollow cracks, quickly, back to back, and then a thud. I took the stairs back down with the same slowness I might use if there were a human threat around that corner. At the bottom, I leaned my head around the wall and took in the scene. Sectional sofa, another big screen TV, big bay window looking out over the dark lawn, busy fireplace. Nothing seemed to have been knocked over or displaced. I walked gently to the center of the room. What had so helped me in the past was a conscious effort to root myself in place and to take no action for a set period of time. allowing my sense of hearing to engage fully with the scene. We'd been trained to do this. That cracking sound, and then that thud tinged with a slight echo. It had sounded as if something had scrambled into a kind of enclosure, probably knocking over pieces of wood that were already weakened. Inside the fireplace, where the flames licked and danced with the comforting visuals I would always associate with Christmas. I turned that way, sensing a weak splash of headlights beyond the living room window. Officer Beth Dulles was just arriving at the curb. Redner's daughter's cat dropped from the inner reaches of the smoke chamber after waiting inside it to emerge. It may have even used its newly enlarged biology to stretch itself across the width of the flue and press firm against the stone walls for more than a full minute. I saw it as a great dark shadow at first, descending directly and fearlessly into the flames. Its body bulged with erratic lumps and muscles in its midsection, its grotesquely thick legs, and its neck, which had elongated to more than a foot in length. It was bending and twisting chaotically, pushing the great head out beyond the fire to get a predatory look at me as it screamed, not in pain but anger. The gaping mouth sprayed pure, loud hate. I was looking at something the size of a Great Dane. One eye was bigger than the other, but each was no smaller than an adult human palm. It broke logs with its weight, and I likely had 1 second to get a shot off before it rushed out at me. I got off 3, actually. The first time I'd ever used real bullets in my brief career as a police officer. And I shot straight and true, and never before or since had chance been so much in my favor. My shots came in such rapid succession, I'm not sure which one went through the thing's neck to decapitate it, and which struck its face and upper chest. The cat thing never made it out of the fireplace. Its remains began to burn merrily as Officer Dulles came through the front door. I sent her immediately up the staircase to check on Redner, so as not to interrupt that disintegration, to give the fire plenty of time to bring logic to disorder. By the time we did reach in to clear the remains, there really wasn't much left to differentiate the cat thing from any other domestic pet, unless you wanted to investigate more closely, ask the kind of questions that would occur naturally to almost no one in the relatively sane world of law enforcement. 21 years ago, that was. When I think about my life since, and all the careers I tried and failed at after being a mediocre cop, that day takes on a funny meaning. Because as uncomfortable as I always felt in that uniform, in that role, the flawlessly deadly 3 shots I aimed at that thing in the fireplace represent the only moment when I've ever performed a crucial task with uncanny skill and untainted luck. My least favorite job was the one that produced my single shining episode of excellence. And no one saw it. I was asked in this entrance essay to describe a time when I surprised myself with my own abilities. I see that I have still fallen just shy of the nonfiction writing program's requirement of 5,000 words. But I feel an odd compulsion to add nothing more, and let the truth and myself be only what they are.